Captain Maria Ghost Vasquez slammed her helmet against the locker as another mission assignment slipped through her fingers. The metallic clang echoed through the empty pilot ready room, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 2 years. While her male squadmates prepped for a high-stakes rescue operation in enemy territory, she was handed keys to a supply chopper again. The worn brass key felt heavy in her palm, a constant reminder of the invisible ceiling that seemed to hover just above her head. Women don't have the upper body strength for combat maneuvers, Colonel Harrison had said earlier that morning, his weathered face set in stone as he delivered the verdict that would keep her grounded for real action once more. It was the same excuse she'd heard for 2 years, delivered with the same patronizing tone that made her teeth ache from clenching her jaw. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could deadlift 250 pounds and had scored higher on every physical fitness test than half the men in her squadron. But somehow she was still deemed too delicate for the cockpit of an Apache attack helicopter. Maria stared at her reflection in the small mirror mounted inside her locker door. At 28, she had already accumulated more flight hours than pilots with twice her experience. But those hours meant nothing when they were logged hauling supplies and ferrying personnel between safe zones. Her call sign Ghost had been earned during training when she'd managed to slip an Apache helicopter through a simulated enemy defense grid without triggering a single alarm. A feat that had left her instructors speechless and her fellow trainees grudgingly impressed. Yet here she was, invisible in all the wrong ways. The ready room door burst open, and Lieutenant Jake "Cowboy" Morrison strutted in, his flight suit already zipped and his helmet tucked under his arm. At 24, he was 4 years younger than Maria and had half her flight experience, but he'd been selected for the rescue mission that should have been hers. His cocky grin faltered slightly when he saw her standing by the lockers, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Hey, Ghost," he said, his voice carrying that forced casualness that men used when they knew they were walking on thin ice. "Heard you got the supply run to Camp Echo. That's important work." Maria's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Right, because delivering toilet paper and MREs is exactly what I spent 4 years at flight school learning to do." She slammed her locker shut with enough force to rattle the entire row. "Tell me, Cowboy, what's your score on the emergency auto-rotation drill?" Jake's face flushed red. They both knew the answer. Maria had beaten his best time by 37 seconds just last week. "Look, I didn't make the assignments." "No, you didn't. But you sure as hell didn't turn it down either." Maria shouldered past him toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "When you're out there playing hero, remember that I could fly circles around you with my eyes closed." That night, Maria found herself alone in the flight simulator. The familiar hum of the machinery, the only sound in the darkened training facility. She'd been coming here every night for months, running through combat scenarios that she might never get to fly in real life. The simulator's cockpit was an exact replica of an Apache's interior, complete with the dual controls and weapon systems that she knew better than her own apartment back home. She initiated a night rescue scenario. Enemy territory, multiple casualties, hostile fire from all directions. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, muscle memory guiding her through evasive maneuvers that would make seasoned combat pilots sweat. The simulated enemy fire lit up her screens as she dove between virtual mountain peaks, her aircraft dancing through the digital death trap with an elegance that bordered on artistry. "Computer, increase difficulty to maximum," she commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The simulation responded by doubling the enemy forces and adding surface-to-air missiles to the mix. Maria's breathing remained controlled as she wove through the deadly gauntlet, her Apache responding to her touch like an extension of her own body. She completed the rescue, extracted all casualties, and returned to base without taking a single hit. A perfect score that the computer logged with clinical indifference. As she powered down the simulator, Maria caught sight of her reflection in the dark screen. Her jaw was clenched with determination, her dark eyes burning with a fire that 2 years of rejection hadn't managed to extinguish. She thought about her father, a Marine who had died in Iraq when she was 16, and the promise she'd made at his funeral to serve her country with the same honor he had shown. "I'll prove them wrong," she whispered to the empty room, her voice carrying the weight of every doubt, every dismissal, every condescending smile she'd endured. "One way or another, I'll prove them all wrong." She didn't know that in 12 hours, a desperate radio call would shatter every assumption about what women could do in the cockpit of a war machine. She didn't know that her moment was coming, arriving with the thunder of rotor blades and the desperate prayers of 500 trapped soldiers who wouldn't care about her gender, only about her skill. The first explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence at forward operating Base Viper like a thunderclap from hell itself. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres jerked awake in his bunk as the entire building shook, dust raining down from the ceiling like snow. For a split second, his sleep-addled brain tried to convince him it was just another training exercise, but the screaming that followed told a different story entirely. "Incoming! Incoming!" The voice over the base loudspeaker was raw with panic as rocket-propelled grenades began falling like deadly rain across the compound. Torres rolled out of his bunk and hit the floor as another explosion rocked the barracks, this one close enough to blow out the windows and send glass shards spinning through the air like crystalline bullets. The Taliban ambush had been planned with military precision, turning what should have been a routine morning into a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Intelligence later revealed that insurgent forces had been moving into position for 3 days, using a network of caves and tunnels that American satellites had never detected. Now, as the sun began to rise over the Afghan mountains, nearly 300 enemy fighters had forward operating Base Viper surrounded in a deadly embrace. Torres grabbed his rifle and body armor, his hands moving with the automatic efficiency of a soldier who had survived 2 previous deployments. Around him, his fellow soldiers were doing the same, men and women who had been sleeping peacefully just moments before, now transformed into a fighting force by the alchemy of survival instinct and training. But as Torres reached the door of the barracks, another RPG struck the building next door, and he watched in horror as the entire structure collapsed in a cloud of concrete dust and twisted metal. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private First Class Sarah Kim, a 19-year-old medic from Ohio who had been in country for only 6 weeks. Her face was pale beneath her helmet, but her hands were steady as she checked her medical kit. "How many of them are out there?" Torres didn't answer because he didn't want to voice what they all suspected. They were outnumbered at least 3 to 1, possibly worse. The base's perimeter defenses had been designed to repel small-scale attacks, not a coordinated assault by hundreds of fighters armed with heavy weapons and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The command bunker's radio crackled to life with reports from observation posts around the base's perimeter. "Up north is taking heavy fire. We've got at least 50 fighters moving up the ridgeline. Up east is compromised. They've got mortar positioned in the village. Up south reports multiple technical vehicles with mounted weapons." Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander, stood over the radio console like a captain going down with his ship. At 52, he was a veteran of 3 wars who'd seen enough combat to know when a situation was spiraling beyond control. The tactical display showed red enemy positions closing in from all directions, a tightening noose that threatened to strangle the life out of his 500 soldiers. "Sir, we need immediate air support," urged Major Lisa Chun, the base's operations officer. Her voice remained calm despite the chaos erupting around them. But Torres could see the fear in her eyes as another explosion shook the bunker. Without close air support, we're sitting ducks. Webb's face was grim as he studied the tactical situation. All our attack helicopters are committed to Operation Desert Falcon. The nearest F-16s are 2 hours out. And by then, he didn't need to finish the sentence. By then, there might not be anyone left to save. Outside the bunker, the battle was intensifying with each passing minute. Torres had taken position behind a concrete barrier with his squad, watching muzzle flashes light up the hillsides like deadly fireflies. The enemy had positioned snipers in the surrounding peaks, and anyone who exposed themselves for more than a few seconds became a target. Already, 3 soldiers had been hit trying to reach the armory, their blood staining the dusty ground dark. Red, medic, medic. The cry came from near the motor pool, where Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez was dragging his wounded squad leader toward cover. Torres could see the man's leg was mangled from shrapnel, bone visible through the torn fabric of his uniform. Private Kim sprinted toward them in a crouch, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as bullets whined overhead. The enemy had clearly studied the base's layout, because their fire was concentrated on the most vulnerable points, the communications array, the fuel depot, the medical facility. Each target was chosen to maximize psychological impact while systematically degrading the base's ability to function. It was textbook asymmetric warfare, executed with a precision that spoke of extensive planning and reconnaissance. "We're cut off," Torres muttered to himself as he watched tracer rounds streak across the main gate. The road that connected FOB Viper to the outside world was now a killing field, swept by machine gun fire from multiple positions. Even if reinforcements were coming, they would never make it through that gauntlet dot in the command bunker. Colonel Webb was facing the hardest decision of his military career. The radio chattered with increasingly desperate reports from his perimeter teams, and the casualty count was climbing with each passing minute. His options were limited and growing fewer by the second. "Sir," Major Chen said quietly, "there is one pilot available for immediate deployment." Webb looked up from the tactical display, hope flickering in his eyes. "Oh, Captain Vasquez. She's prepped for a supply run, but her Apache is fully armed and fueled." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Everyone in the bunker knew about Maria Vasquez and her reputation. They also knew about the unofficial policy that kept women out of direct combat roles. Thought another explosion rocked the base. Closer this time, and Webb could hear the screams of wounded soldiers over the radio. The decision crystallized in his mind. With brutal clarity, protocol and politics meant nothing when his people were dying. "Get me Vasquez," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Now." Maria's Apache helicopter screamed across the desert at 150 miles per hour, the twin turboshaft engines roaring like caged beasts as she pushed the aircraft to its limits. The radio call had come just as she was preparing for her routine supply run, Colonel. Webb's voice cutting through static with words that would forever change her life. "Ghost, we need you at FOB Viper. 500 souls are counting on you." Now, 30 minutes later, she was racing toward what intelligence reports described as a complex ambush with overwhelming enemy forces. Her co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Carlos Razor Martinez, sat in the front gunner's seat, his hands dancing across the weapons control systems as he prepared their arsenal for the fight ahead. At 35, Martinez was a veteran of 4 deployments who had initially been skeptical about flying with a woman. That skepticism had evaporated during their first training flight together, when Maria had executed a series of combat maneuvers. That left him speechless. "Ghost, you've got 3 SAM sites painting you." Martinez's voice crackled through the intercom as his threat detection systems lit up like a Christmas tree. The enemy had positioned Soviet-era S-7 surface-to-air missiles in the hills surrounding FOB Viper, creating a deadly umbrella of overlapping fire zones. Bearing 270, 315, and 045. They're all active and tracking. Maria's response was to throw the Apache into a violent spiral dive, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat as the aircraft plummeted toward the valley floor. Behind them, 3 missiles streaked through the air where they had been just seconds before, their contrails writing death sentences in the morning sky. She pulled out of the dive at the last possible moment. The helicopter skids, nearly kissing the desert sand as she leveled off and began weaving between rocky outcroppings. "Jesus, Ghost!" Martinez shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "Video games," Maria replied with grim humor, her hands moving across the controls with surgical precision. It wasn't entirely a joke. She had spent countless hours in flight simulators, pushing virtual aircraft through scenarios that most pilots would never attempt in real life. Now those hours of practice were paying dividends as she danced her Apache through a gauntlet that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilots. The landscape below was a moonscape of brown hills and scattered villages, but Maria's trained eye could pick out the signs of enemy activity. Muzzle flashes winked from concealed positions, and she could see the heat signatures of vehicles and personnel through her thermal imaging system. The enemy had chosen their positions well, using the natural terrain to create interlocking fields of fire that would make any approach to FOB Viper a nightmare. "Viper Base, this is Ghost inbound," Maria transmitted as she crested a ridge and caught her first glimpse of the besieged outpost. What she saw made her blood run cold. The base was completely surrounded, with enemy forces positioned on every piece of high ground within a 3-mile radius. Smoke rose from multiple buildings within the compound, and she could see the distinctive signatures of mortar rounds impacting inside the perimeter. "Ghost, Viper Base," came Colonel Webb's voice, strained but steady. "We have multiple casualties, requiring immediate evacuation. The LZ is hot. Repeat. The LZ is extremely hot. Enemy has direct fire on all approaches." Maria studied the tactical situation through her helmet-mounted display, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, and threat vectors. The landing zone was a small cleared area in the center of the base, surrounded by buildings and completely exposed to enemy fire from the surrounding hills. It was, in military parlance, a death trap. "Copy that, Viper Base. Beginning my approach now." What happened next would be studied in military academies for years to come. Instead of making a direct approach to the landing zone, Maria began what she called her ghost dance, a series of seemingly random maneuvers that kept the enemy guessing about her intentions while systematically eliminating their most dangerous weapons. She started by diving toward the eastern ridgeline, drawing fire from a concealed machine gun position. As tracer rounds reached up toward her aircraft like deadly fingers, she suddenly pulled into a climbing turn and unleashed a Hellfire missile that turned the enemy position into a ball of orange flame. Before the smoke had cleared, she was already moving toward the next threat, her 30mm chain gun chattering as she suppressed a mortar team that had been raining death on the base. "Ghost, you've got a technical vehicle moving to intercept," Martinez called out, his voice tight with concentration as he tracked multiple targets through his gunner's sight. "Pickup truck with a mounted heavy machine gun, bearing 180. Maria banked hard left, the Apache responding to her touch like a thoroughbred racehorse. The enemy vehicle was racing across the desert floor, kicking up a plume of dust as it tried to get into position to engage her aircraft. She could see the muzzle flashes from the mounted weapon, but the gunner was firing wildly, his shots going wide as he struggled to track her erratic flight path. "I see him," Maria replied, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. She rolled the Apache inverted and dove toward the vehicle, the world spinning crazily outside her cockpit. As she lined up for a gun run, the 30mm cannon spoke with authority, its depleted uranium rounds chewing through the truck's engine block and turning the vehicle into a twisted wreck. But the enemy was adapting to her tactics, and as she pulled out of her attack dive, a new threat appeared on her scope. "Sam launch! Sam launch!" Martinez shouted as a surface-to-air missile streaked up from a previously undetected position. The missile seeker head had locked onto their heat signature, and it was closing fast. Maria's response was instinctive and immediate. She dumped flares while simultaneously throwing the Apache into a series of violent, evasive maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and crew to their limits. The missile passed so close to their tail rotor that Martinez could see the Cyrillic markings on its warhead, but it detonated harmlessly in the cloud of flares that Maria had deployed. "That was too close," Martinez muttered, his hands shaking slightly as he reacquired targets through his sight. "Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades," Maria replied, but her own heart was hammering against her ribs. She had been flying on pure instinct and adrenaline, but she knew that luck could only carry them so far. The enemy was learning from each of her attacks, adjusting their tactics and preparing for her next move. Below them, FOB Viper was still under siege, and she could see soldiers moving between buildings in desperate attempts to reach wounded comrades. Time was running out, and she knew that her next decision would determine whether 500 American soldiers lived or died in this godforsaken valley. "Viper base Ghost," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm coming in hot. Have your casualties ready for immediate evacuation. Roger. Ghost. And ... Q." Maria didn't respond to the gratitude in Colonel Webb's voice. There would be time for thanks later, if they all survived the next 10 minutes. Right now, she had a job to do, and she intended to do it regardless of the cost. The landing zone at FOB Viper looked like the mouth of hell itself as Maria brought her Apache in for the first extraction. Smoke billowed from burning buildings, while mortar rounds continued to impact around the small cleared area that would serve as her touchdown point. The space was barely larger than a basketball court, surrounded by concrete barriers and shipping containers that provided some protection from small arms fire but made the approach treacherous for a helicopter the size of an Apache. "Ghost, be advised. Enemy has direct line of sight on the LZ from multiple positions." Colonel Webb's voice crackled through her headset as she began her descent. "We'll provide suppressing fire, but you're going to be exposed." Maria's hands were steady on the controls, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had trained for this moment in countless simulations, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of descending into a cauldron of enemy fire with the lives of wounded soldiers hanging in the balance. Through her helmet-mounted display, she could see muzzle flashes winking from the surrounding hills like deadly stars. "Razor, I need you to keep their heads down," she commanded as the Apache settled into a hover 20 feet above the landing zone. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris, creating a brownout condition that made visibility nearly zero. She was flying on instruments and instinct now, trusting her training and her co-pilot to guide her safely to the ground. Martinez's 30mm cannon erupted in a sustained burst, the depleted uranium rounds chewing through enemy positions with devastating effect. "Suppressing the ridgeline," he reported, his voice tight with concentration as he tracked targets through the swirling dust cloud. "But there's too many of them, Ghost. They're everywhere." The Apache touched down with a bone-jarring impact, and immediately Maria could hear the distinctive crack of rifle rounds striking the aircraft's armored hull. The enemy had been waiting for this moment, and now they unleashed everything they had at the stationary helicopter. Bullets sparked off the titanium armor plating while larger caliber rounds from heavy machine guns hammered against the cockpit glass. "Casualties coming in," shouted Sergeant Torres as he and 3 other soldiers emerged from the smoke, carrying a stretcher between them. The wounded man was unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood from multiple shrapnel wounds. Behind them came more soldiers, some walking wounded who clutched bandaged arms and limbs, others being carried by their comrades. Maria kept the engine spooled up and ready for immediate takeoff while Martinez continued to lay down suppressing fire. Through her side window, she could see the organized chaos of a medical evacuation under fire soldiers moving with practiced efficiency despite the bullets whining overhead. Medics working frantically to stabilize the most critically wounded, and officers coordinating the evacuation with hand signals because the noise made verbal communication impossible. "That's 8 casualties loaded," came the report from the crew chief who had materialized beside her aircraft. Staff Sergeant Williams was a 20-year veteran who had seen more combat evacuations than he cared to remember, but even he looked shaken by the intensity of the enemy fire. "We've got room for maybe 2 more stretcher cases." "Load them up," Maria commanded, her eyes scanning the instrument panel for any signs of damage. So far, the Apache was holding together despite the punishment it was taking, but she could see hydraulic fluid beginning to leak from somewhere in the engine compartment. They were living on borrowed time. The last 2 casualties were loaded, a young female soldier who couldn't have been more than 20, her leg mangled by a mortar fragment, and a sergeant whose face was wrapped in bloody bandages. As soon as the crew chief gave her the thumbs up, Maria pulled pitch and lifted off into the maelstrom of enemy fire. "Ghost, you've got an RPG team setting up on the North Ridge," Martinez called out as they climbed away from the landing zone. Through his gunner's sight, he could see 2 insurgents manhandling a rocket-propelled grenade launcher into position. "They're trying to get a shot at us." Maria banked hard right, using a burning building as cover while she gained altitude. The RPG rounds streaked past their tail boom, close enough that she could feel the aircraft shudder from the pressure wave. She made a mental note of the enemy position. She would deal with them on her next approach. The flight to the medical facility at camp Bastion took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Maria flew nap of the earth, using every piece of terrain to mask their approach while Martinez monitored their wounded passengers. 2 of the soldiers were in critical condition, their lives measured in minutes rather than hours. "How many more trips?" Martinez asked as they touched down at the medical facility and watched the wounded being rushed into the trauma center. Maria checked her fuel gauge and weapon status. They had enough fuel for 3 more round trips, maybe 4, if she pushed it. But the Apache was showing signs of battle damage warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, and she could feel a slight vibration in the controls that hadn't been there before. "As many as it takes," she replied, lifting off for the return flight to Fob Viper. The second extraction was worse than the first. The enemy had adjusted their tactics, concentrating their fire on the landing zone and setting up additional weapons positions to cover the approaches. As Maria descended through the smoke and dust, an RPG round exploded just 50 feet from her aircraft, the blast wave slamming into the Apache like an invisible fist. "We're hit," Martinez shouted as warning alarms began screaming in the cockpit. "Tail rotor damage. We're losing hydraulic pressure." Maria fought to maintain control as the helicopter began to yaw uncontrollably. The tail rotor, damaged by shrapnel from the RPG explosion, was no longer providing adequate anti-torque control. She compensated by adjusting her power settings and using the rudder pedals to maintain heading, but she knew they were flying a crippled aircraft. "Can you hold it together?" Martinez asked, his voice tight with concern. "I'll hold it together with my bare hands if I have to," Maria replied through gritted teeth. The Apache was shaking like a paint mixer, but she managed. to set it down in the landing zone for the second time. More wounded soldiers were loaded aboard, men and women who looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe as they realized that this pilot was risking everything to save their lives. The third trip was a nightmare of mechanical failures and enemy fire. The hydraulic system was failing, making the controls increasingly heavy and unresponsive. The engine temperature was climbing into the red zone, and Maria could smell smoke beginning to seep into the cockpit. But still, she pressed on, because there were still wounded soldiers at Fob Viper who needed her. "Ghost, you need to abort," came Colonel Webb's voice over the radio as she approached for the fourth time. "Your aircraft is too damaged." "We can't ask you to." "With respect, sir," Maria interrupted. "You're not asking. I'm volunteering." The fourth landing was the worst yet. As the Apache settled into the landing zone, a mortar round exploded just 30 feet away, sending shrapnel through the cockpit and shattering the armored glass. Maria felt something hot slice across her cheek, and blood began running down her face, but her hands never left the controls. "Jesus, Ghost, you're bleeding," Martinez said, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," she replied, though she could taste copper in her mouth. "How many more?" "This is the last group," came the report from the ground. 12 more casualties, but some of them are walking wounded. As the final group of soldiers climbed aboard her battered Apache, Maria caught sight of her reflection in a piece of broken glass. Her face was streaked with blood and grime, her flight suit torn and stained, but her eyes burned with a determination that no amount of enemy fire could extinguish. "Everyone aboard?" she asked. "Roger, Ghost. All souls accounted for." Maria pulled. Pitch one final time, coaxing her dying aircraft into the air through sheer force of will. The Apache climbed slowly, reluctantly, like a wounded bird struggling to reach safety. Behind them, Fob Viper continued to burn, but every American soldier who had been wounded in the attack was now safe, thanks to a pilot who had refused to accept the word impossible. As they limped toward the medical facility, Martinez turned to look at her with something approaching reverence. "Ghost," he said quietly, "that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen." Maria didn't respond immediately. She was too busy keeping their crippled aircraft in the air, fighting controls that grew heavier with each passing minute. But finally, as the medical facility came into view, she allowed herself a small smile. "Just doing my job, Razor. Just doing my job." When Maria finally touched down at the medical base, her Apache helicopter looked like it had been through a blender operated by a madman. The aircraft settled onto the landing pad with a grinding screech of tortured metal, hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple punctures, while smoke poured from the engine compartment. The maintenance crew that rushed to meet them stopped dead in their tracks, staring in disbelief at what remained of the once pristine war machine. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Wrench Patterson, a 25-year veteran who had seen everything the military had to offer, walked slowly around the Apache with the reverence of a man examining a miracle. He counted 147 bullet holes in the fuselage, 3 separate hydraulic leaks, a cracked rotor mast that should have caused catastrophic failure, and a tail rotor that was held together by little more than hope and determination. "Ma'am," he said to Maria as she climbed down from the cockpit, blood still trickling from the cut on her cheek, "I've been working on helicopters since before you were born, and I have no idea how this bird is still in one piece. By all rights, you should have crashed 20 minutes ago." Maria wiped the blood from her face with the back of her glove and looked back at her battered aircraft. The Apache that had carried her into legend was dying before her eyes, its engines winding down with the labored wheeze of a machine that had given everything it had to give. "She's a tough old bird," Maria said quietly. "Tougher than anyone gave her credit for." The words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on anyone present. In the space of 4 hours, Maria had shattered every preconception about women in combat aviation, proving that courage and skill had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with the content of one's character. The story of her rescue mission spread through the military community like wildfire. Within hours, grainy cell phone footage of her bullet-riddled Apache was being shared across social media platforms, accompanied by first-hand accounts from the soldiers she had saved. Staff Sergeant Torres, his arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds, gave an interview to a military journalist that would be quoted for years to come. "I don't care if that pilot was a man, woman, or Martian," Torres said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I heard those rotors coming through the smoke and gunfire, I knew we were going to make it home. Captain Vasquez didn't just save our lives. She restored my faith in what it means to be a soldier." The Pentagon, initially caught off guard by the media attention, quickly realized they had a public relations goldmine on their hands. Within a week, Maria found herself standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross from the President himself. The ceremony was broadcast live to a global audience, and the image of Maria in her dress blues, the medal gleaming on her chest, became an iconic symbol of courage and determination. But the real change was happening in recruiting stations across the country. Young women who had never considered military service were walking through the doors, asking about aviation programs and combat roles. Flight schools that had struggled to meet diversity quotas suddenly found themselves with waiting lists of qualified female applicants. The woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough to fly combat missions had inspired an entire generation to prove that strength came in many forms. Colonel Webb, who had made the decision to send Maria into combat, found himself testifying before Congress about the incident. When asked why he had chosen to deploy a female pilot into such a dangerous situation, his answer was simple and direct: "Because she was the best pilot available, and my soldiers deserved the best." The policy changes came swiftly after that. The informal barriers that had kept women out of combat aviation roles crumbled in the face of Maria's undeniable success. Flight training programs were restructured to focus on skill and aptitude rather than outdated assumptions about physical capabilities. The military, an institution not known for rapid change, transformed itself almost overnight. Maria herself struggled with the sudden fame and attention. She had never sought to be a symbol or a trailblazer. She had simply wanted to serve her country and fly helicopters. The constant media requests and speaking engagements felt foreign to someone who was more comfortable in a cockpit than in front of a camera. But she understood the importance of her role in inspiring others, and she embraced the responsibility with the same determination she had shown over Phobe Viper. 3 years later, Maria stood in front of a class of new flight students at Fort Rucker, Alabama. The group was evenly split between men and women, a sight that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Among the students was Lieutenant Sarah Kim, the young medic who had been at Phobe Viper during the attack and had been inspired to become a pilot herself. "Flying isn't about being fearless," Maria told the class, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. "Fear is a natural response to danger, and anyone who tells you they're not afraid in combat is either lying or too stupid to understand the situation. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite that fear." She paused, looking out at the eager faces before her, seeing in them the future of military aviation. Some of you will face situations where everything seems impossible, where the odds are stacked against you, and everyone expects you to fail. In those moments, remember that the only limitations that truly matter are the ones you place on yourself. After the class, Lieutenant Kim approached her instructor with a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Ma'am, how did you find The strength to keep flying when your helicopter was falling apart around you? Maria smiled, remembering her own doubts and fears from that day over Fog Viper. I thought about all the people who said I couldn't do it, and I decided I'd rather die trying than live knowing I'd given up. But more than that, I thought about the soldiers who were counting on me. When you're responsible for other people's lives, you find strength you never knew you had. The legend of Ghost Vasquez continued to grow over the years. Her story was taught in military academies around the world as an example of exceptional airmanship under fire. The Apache helicopter she had flown that day was eventually restored and placed in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where a plaque told the story of the pilot who had refused to accept limitations. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. 10 years after the rescue at Fog Viper, Maria received a letter from Afghanistan. It was signed by 500 soldiers, every person who had been at the base that day, along with their children and grandchildren. The letter was simple and direct. Captain Vasquez, you didn't just save our lives that day. You showed us what it means to never give up, to push beyond what others think is possible, and to serve something greater than ourselves. We are proud to have served with you, and we will never forget the sound of your rotors coming through the darkness. Maria kept that letter in her office, next to a photo of her father in his marine dress blues. Sometimes, when young pilots asked her about that day over Fog Viper, she would show them the letter and tell them the truth that had taken her years to understand. I didn't become a legend because I was fearless. I became a legend because I was more afraid of letting my brothers and sisters down than I was of dying. That's not courage, that's love. And love, it turns out, is the strongest force in the universe. The woman they once said couldn't handle combat had become the pilot every soldier prayed would answer their distress call. But more than that, she had become proof that the only barriers that truly matter are the ones we refuse to break down ourselves.